You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
On 3rd January 2021, Covaxin became India's first indigenously produced vaccine against novel coronavirus to get emergency approval in public health interest in clinical trial mode. Vaccine is jointly made by Bharat Biotech, Indian Council of Medical Research, and the National Institute of Virology. However, its approval raised many questions, especially since phase 3 clinical trials were still ongoing and no efficacy data had been published. Several media outlets in January 2021 reported on the vaccine's clinical trial at People's Hospital in Bhopal, one of the several sites where phase 3 trials are taking place. The reports pointed to how poor people were lured without any understanding that they were taking part in a vaccine trial and not a vaccination drive. There has been one death and several participants have reported illnesses at the site. To understand the ethical breaches in the trial and what it means for Covaxin, for today's episode we spoke to Priyanka Pulla, a freelance science journalist who reported on what makes the data from People's Hospital's clinical trial tainted. You're tuned in to The Big Story, the podcast where we dissect the headline-making news for you, and I'm your host, Himmat. Priyanka, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Ahmed.
So my first question is that you've argued that the data from Covaxin's Bhopal trial is tainted. You reviewed the copy of the protocol of the Covaxin phase 3 trial, and you found specific violations of the protocol. Can you take us through what kind of data were they supposed to collect from the participants?
Sure. So the phase 3 trial, any phase 3 trial for a vaccine typically looks at efficacy and safety. Now, efficacy means you're basically evaluating whether the vaccine protects you against disease. That's pretty simple. And safety means whether it triggers a higher rate of adverse events. They can be mild adverse events. They can be serious adverse events that lead to death or hospitalization. But that's what safety means. You compare the rate of adverse events in the vaccine arm with the placebo arm. Now, in adverse events, there were multiple kinds they were looking at, around 7 kinds of adverse events. The first among them was solicited adverse events. Now, this is basically what Bharat Biotech had already seen this kind of side effect to occur in its previous trials. And they're generally expected with a lot of vaccines, which is basically, fever, muscle pain, joint pain, chills, headache, vomiting. This is something you'd expect within the days following the vaccine. It's also known as reactogenicity. And to monitor this, Bharat Biotech's plan was to call all participants for 7 days in the week following the first and the second dose. So these phone calls were a critical part of collecting this data. In addition, they were also supposed to get diaries. Each participant gets a diary where they fill the information about these 12 expected symptoms, the solicited adverse events, right? Now, what we need to remember is that this data had to be collected in fairly good detail, right? Like if somebody has a fever, let's say somebody from People's Hospital is calling a participant and say, did you experience any of these 12 adverse events? And they say, yes, I have a fever. They would then ask them to measure the temperature, and then they would classify it as a grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, or grade 4. So you would do this for all the adverse events, including pain, swelling, hardness, redness, right? So there was a very properly set process of collecting this data, and that is important. We need to remember that this data has to be collected both accurately and immediately, because that was the trial protocol, right? People tend to forget. They may not be able to measure the intensity of the adverse event later if you do not collect it immediately, etc. Then they were also collecting data on serious adverse events, which is basically an adverse event that leads to death or hospitalization or prolonged illness. And another thing I wanted to draw attention to is that they were looking at the possibility of vaccine-associated enhanced respiratory disease.
Okay.
What this means, quite simply, is that there was a worry, there was a risk that Covaxin could, instead of protecting against COVID, actually give a person a more severe version of COVID when they are exposed to the virus after vaccination,
Hmm.
right? This is obviously not what you want. You want the vaccine to protect you against mild, moderate, or severe COVID, but instead, but this phenomenon has been seen to happen with other vaccines. For example, a similar phenomenon occurred with the dengue vaccine, with denguexia,
Hmm.
where somebody who got the vaccine who was later exposed to the virus would get a more severe version of dengue. So to track that is also a safety parameter.
Hmm.
They were looking for the likelihood. Now the likelihood is not very high, but it was an important parameter for safety of this vaccine.
Hmm.
Um, so anyway, this gives you an idea of the kind of adverse events they were looking for.
Yeah.
But how do you do this in a trial where you have 26,000 people, right?
Hmm.
Because you give them an injection and then they go back home and they're completely out of the picture. So how do you get this data on time and accurate data? So for this, it's important to remember that every participant had to be aware that they had to report back to the hospital if they were feeling sick, right? So that's a critical part of the protocol of the trial, that people know that we are in a trial and we will, if we experience COVID symptoms, if we experience adverse effects, events, we need to go back and tell the hospital. And also the hospital has to make every possible attempt to reach them at predefined times.
Hmm.
Um, and this is true across all vaccine trials, right? The participants you recruit have to be communicated with constantly. You cannot lose track of them, and everybody has to be aware of their roles in the trial, including participants. So
Hmm.
broadly, this is what the protocol says, that we will look at efficacy and safety, and this is how we will do it.
But your investigation reveals that this didn't really happen. There were several flaws in following up with participants. Can you take us through your findings? What really happened? What data did they actually collect?
Yeah. I mean, this was not just reported by me, but by dozens of reporters since January onwards. As you may know, that initially there were a lot of news reports of many of the participants saying that they did not know they were in a clinical trial.
Hmm.
So that is a breach of something called informed consent. Like, nobody should be part of a clinical trial unless they know that it's an experiment and it's not a vaccination drive, right? This supposed to be explained very well to each participant.
Yeah.
But the other aspect of this is, because the participants did not know that they were in a trial, when some of them fell sick, they did not realize that they could call the hospital and tell them and get treatment from the hospital.
Hmm.
And this, uh, if and the scale of this is not small. Because there are several health activist groups working in Bhopal with victims of the 1984 industrial gas leak, including Rachna Dhingra.
Hmm.
And all these activists have been working very closely with this group of people for many years. So they know they know the people who ended up being participants in the trial in Bhopal.
Hmm.
And they realized that they had been a vaccination a trial, and people were falling sick. They didn't know what to do, where to go. Um, and uh, and it seems like it was a pattern, because it happened on a fairly large scale. Hundreds of people have made this claim that we got the injections, but we didn't know it was a trial. We thought it was a vaccination drive.
Hmm.
So that is the first breach, in the sense we know that participants did not realize that they were supposed to report their adverse events, or if they developed symptoms of COVID-19, because they simply didn't know if they were in a trial. The second breach is just the collection of solicited adverse events. The hospital was supposed to call every participant for 7 days in a week after the first and second injection. Many of the participants said they never received those calls, or received just one or two calls. And this has again been independently verified by several journalists, including me. I have spoken to 6 or 7 participants, and they say, yeah, they call sometimes and they didn't call at others.
Hmm.
Now, this is a protocol breach, okay? Because what we don't realize is that the protocol is a fairly it's an important document. Once
Yeah.
you've written down that this
Yeah.
has to happen, it has to happen,
Yes, of
right?
course.
Yeah. So So that's the other thing. A lot of participants weren't contacted. They did not go back to the hospital,
Hmm.
and also there were participants who fell sick and who did realize they could go back to the hospital to be treated, but when they went to the hospital sometimes turned them away,
Oh.
because by asking them to pay for their treatment. And many of these
Hmm.
participants came from very poor socioeconomic backgrounds, and they were not willing to pay, so they left, which means that the data of their illnesses wasn't captured by the hospital. So all this suggests that a lot of data is missing. A lot of
Hmm.
critical data is missing if you compare it with the trial protocol. Yeah.
Why is it so important to safeguard the integrity of the data and like immediately record all the adverse events? Like, and how do trials ensure this happens?
Yeah, so solicited adverse events, for example, I was reading
Hmm.
the Pfizer vaccine protocol,
Yeah.
and how they did it is every participant gets installs an app on their phone, which
Hmm.
is basically an electronic diary, and in that they're supposed to note down all the solicited adverse events: fever, myalgia, uh, chills, and soreness, redness,
Hmm.
and grade it every single day. So they do it through a phone app, and the protocol says that if they do not record it within the 7 days, they're not allowed to record it later. So I think that's a
Hmm.
way to ensure that the data is fresh and immediate, because when you're collecting this data on a very large scale from 26,000 people, you
Hmm.
want it to be the resolution to be high. You want it to be, fine grained data. So uh, so that's one reason why you would do it immediately, which I'm guessing is why also this protocol required, 7 phone calls 7 days a week, because you want participants to talk about it as soon as possible, measure the intensity of the adverse event. Otherwise, you will, as one of the people I spoke to told me, you will lose that resolution of data if you don't do it properly. If you don't do record these immediately.
Hmm. But can failing to gathering data from one participant affect the efficacy of the entire trial? Like,
Yeah, so I mean, I'm sure protocol violations and deviations happen when you have
hmm.
such a large trial,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Maybe you may not be able to call all 1,700 people on time,
Hmm.
uh, but there are systems in place to figure out what went wrong if this happens.
Hmm.
If you realize that a lot of people are not picking up their calls, solicited adverse event calls, then what People's Hospital should have done is they should have gone back,
Hmm.
uh, figured out if something is wrong, figured out if their phones were not working, because often participants will not pick up the call if they're sick, right?
Hmm.
So the point I'm trying to make is that even if you do not have data from one participant, that's fine. The worry here is that so many different people have reported the same story, which
Hmm.
suggests that there is a pattern, and it suggests that something was going wrong at People's Hospital's end. It wasn't just one odd participant who had a phone that ran out of charge,
Hmm.
or lost his phone for several days. The hospital itself did not put a system in place which could, aggressively, vigorously follow up participants. Now,
Hmm.
now that is a problem, because the greater the amount of data that is missing, the more likely it is going to throw off your ultimate safety and efficacy analysis,
Hmm.
right? Because yeah, so, and there were 1,700 people
Hmm.
at the Bhopal site of the trial,
Yeah.
out of which some Rachna Dhingra has estimated that almost 900 participants came from vulnerable communities, and
Hmm.
all of them experienced some form of protocol deviation or the other.
Hmm. Can you give us some specific examples or case studies where protocol was not followed or a participant's data was not collected at all?
Yeah. So one example is that of Jitendra Natvaria.
Mm-hmm.
So he got his vaccine, I believe, on December 10th. And then around 4 days later, he started experiencing, fever, cough, etc., which I think would have fallen into, the category of solicited adverse events.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for whatever reason, he realized that he could go to the hospital and seek treatment, which he did. But, I spoke to him and he told me that when he reached the hospital, they asked him to do a bunch of tests, including an RT-PCR, to check if he had developed COVID 19.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a poor daily wage laborer. So he was like, I have, firstly lost my income for so many days because I've been feeling sick. He stopped going to work from the day after the injection in the trial. And he was like, how am I going to pay this? So he was apparently kept waiting there for several hours, and then he
Mm-hmm.
decided to just go home. And then almost, weeks later, Dhingra went and contacted him, and she learned that he was still sick, and she convinced him to go back to the hospital. And when he went the second time, he got treatment. But
Mm-hmm.
that raises a question of, what happened during this period where all this data was to be collected by People's Hospital, whether it was a solicited adverse event or an unsolicited adverse event, why it happened, was it due to the vaccine, was it due to something else? So there are multiple breaches here if you
Mm-hmm.
compare it with the protocol.
You mentioned unsolicited events and solicited adverse events and a
Yeah.
serious adverse event. And a serious adverse event did take place. A participant did die. How did the People's Hospital investigate the death? And was what they did enough to explain what the death, why the death happened?
Yeah, so this is the one serious adverse event that has been reported from Bhopal. This is what the media has picked up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there may be more, uh, which may not have been attributed. Maybe it wasn't just picked up by the news, but we know that this one person died, and the hospital concluded that the death was unrelated to the vaccine. Now, there are several issues with this. So, how do you determine that a death in a trial is related to a vaccine or not? You will look at, firstly, whether the person was in the vaccine arm or in the placebo arm,
Mm-hmm.
right? This wasn't known by the investigators because the trial was they were still blinded
Mm-hmm.
uh, when this happened. So it was a randomized, controlled, and blinded trial, and they did not um, unblind because they concluded that the reason for the death was something else. So basically, they don't know whether it's a vaccine or the placebo. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
then you will also you if this person, he died after he died at home. He died 9 days after he received an injection in the trial,
Mm-hmm.
and the team from the hospital basically did a postmortem, and the postmortem suggested signs of poisoning, based on which they concluded that he died of suspected poisoning and therefore unlikely to be due to the vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem with this is that if somebody dies at home and not in your presence,
Mm-hmm.
then you will have to make an attempt to understand the sequence of symptoms and events before they die, because they're very crucial to understanding what killed that person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if it was sudden poisoning, then it's likely that that person did not expect any symptoms until they consumed the poison, and then the health rapidly deteriorated and they died.
Mm-hmm.
But if it is vaccine related, it's more likely that the symptoms began soon after they got the injection, right? Now, in this case, there's a discrepancy between what the family of Deepak Maravi, who was the person who passed away, says, and what the hospital says. The hospital says we called him all 7 days after the injection and he said he was fine. Whereas the family says that he started feeling sick immediately after he got the injection,
Mm-hmm.
and over a period of time he became sicker and sicker. The hospital did not know about this, and then he passed away. So that is a very crucial discrepancy. And if the family is saying something else, the hospital really should take what the family said into account, because they were the
Yeah.
ones with him when he passed away. You can't just rule over what the caregivers are saying, right? And the hospital has not explained why they have completely ignored the other version of events. So that is one issue. The second issue is the vaccine versus placebo. You don't know what this person got. And the third issue is I had a forensic pathologist look at both the postmortem report and what is known as a viscera report, which is an analysis of the internal organs, which is done by a forensic lab. And the hospital claims that they point to poisoning, but according to the forensic pathologist I spoke to, they do not. For a number of reasons. I mean, because you will not say a death is due to poisoning unless you're able to identify what the poison is. But no such poison was found in the viscera analysis. They only found ethyl alcohol, which is the alcohol we drink, and they found a drug used for acidity, which is omeprazole. Neither of these could have caused the kind of symptoms which Maravi experienced, the family says he experienced, or even the symptoms which are recorded by the hospital in the postmortem report. So none of this really fits together, which raises the question of why both Bharat Biotech and People Hospital are saying with such certainty that the death was not related to the vaccine. Because you would wait until the investigators were blinded, the ethics committees were blinded, and if he was in the placebo arm, then you could be absolutely sure it was not due to the vaccine. But until then, the certainty is unwarranted. Now, I'll make a disclaimer here. When you have such a large clinical trial, there will be people who die due to coincidental reasons which have nothing to do with the vaccine. We need to remember that not every death or not every hospitalization is due to the vaccine. But the point is, you still need to investigate this, because this is a safety trial. This is a phase 3 safety trial, and the whole point of this trial is to characterize the safety of the vaccine. So if you don't do a good job of it, it raises a lot of questions about how well you're doing the trial. So that is the issue here. I mean, both People's Hospital and Bharat Biotech should have just said that we are still looking into the matter, or it could be possibly related, and we will know at the end of the trial. But they have not done that. Instead, they have gone to the media and they have told people what is a very controversial version of events, which is that Deepak Maravi was fine for 7 days and then he suddenly passed away due to a poison.
Has the People's Hospital, Bharat Biotech, and ICMR responded to any of these events? And have they given a reason to why they didn't follow clinical protocols? Do the responses hold up according to you?
No, so this has been what I think is the most disappointing part, because all the allegations about ethical breaches and protocol violations have been very widespread. Like I said, number of newspapers reported it. There are video recordings of participants saying, "I didn't know I was in a trial," and it's something you should take seriously, unless you're claiming that everybody's lying, right? And the participants' claims are worrying if you compare them with the protocol, because there is a protocol and it seems like it wasn't done, right? So, and at the very least, there are one or two allegations which I would say are proven, because People's Hospital has said, the vice chancellor of People's University has said in an interview on the official channel of People's University on YouTube, that the hospital was only giving a copy of the informed consent form to each participant when they asked for it. Now, this is something the hospital has said on record. Now, this is a violation right there, right? The basic principle of good clinical practices in Indian law is that every participant gets a copy of the informed consent form. There is no room for debate here, right? This is the law. If you don't do it, you're clearly in the wrong. And the hospital has openly admitted that they did not give it, right? So there is a violation, plain and simple. It's not something ICMR can deny. Because the hospital has it's not something Bharat Biotech can deny. They may deny the other things. They may say, we tried to call the participants and we didn't get through, and we decided not to use the data in the trial. You may deny several other aspects, but there is no room for debate here. And yet, amazingly, the Indian Council of Medical Research and Bharat Biotech have completely denied all allegations and said they followed Indian law to the letter. That doesn't hold up to the smell test.
Yeah.
I mean, it's yeah, it's unfortunate because it's not defensible.
What steps should the regulators be taking next to protect the integrity of the trial?
Yeah, so there is a very good multi-tiered system
Mm-hmm.
in place to ensure that the trial uh, happens the way it's
Mm-hmm.
supposed to. So it begins with, so first there is a principal investigator who is conducting the trial, his or her team of
Mm-hmm.
investigators. Above them, there is something called an ethics
Mm-hmm.
committee. Which is supposed to oversee the trial, make sure all protocols are followed, make sure there are no ethical
Mm-hmm.
breaches, and if something goes wrong, they're supposed to step in and say, look, take a
Mm-hmm.
moment and do things differently. Apart from them, there's something called a trial monitor. In this case, it was a company called
Mm-hmm.
Equia, which is again doing the exact same thing. They are ensuring that everything goes according to plan. Above them, there's something called a data and safety monitoring board, which is a central body which looks at all the sites
Mm-hmm.
together. Then there are the sponsors, which is ICMR and Bharat
Mm-hmm.
Biotech. And then outside all of this is the Drug Controller General of India, the CDSCO, our drug regulator, which basically enforces the law which regulates clinical trial. That's called the New Drug and
Mm-hmm.
Clinical Trial Rules. So there are multiple levels of oversight here. Now, firstly, the ethics committee, which is the first
Mm-hmm.
level, should have ensured that this didn't happen, should have ensured that so many participants were not should have ensured that People's Hospital consented all participants properly, right? Even if they did not manage, for some reason the oversight was lax, maybe they did not visit the trial site often. When so many news reports came out in the public, then they should have begun an
Mm-hmm.
investigation. And there are ways to do this investigation, because documents are supposed to be maintained. If you're recruiting vulnerable participants, people who cannot read or write, or people from ethnic
Mm-hmm.
minorities, the law requires the informed consent process to be video recorded. So the ethics committee could have checked the video records, except the hospital says we did not do video recordings. Again, this is an obvious violation. So they could have stepped in, and they could have said, this is going wrong, and this is how we're going to fix the problem. Either we're going to get rid of all the data that is flawed and only use the remaining data. Maybe we will increase the number of participants at the trial to make up for the participants from whom data collected is flawed. There are many things they could have done. Um, but what seems to have happened eventually is that the ethics committee has again denied everything. People's Hospitals
Mm-hmm.
denied everything, and even Bharat Biotech denied everything. Now, this is the point where you would expect the Drug Controller of General of India, the regulator, to step in and say, "Look, we're seeing all these things going wrong. So give us your show us your audit trail, and we will look into whether everything was done according to plan." But the Drug Controller India has also been completely
Mm-hmm.
silent on the issue. Now, this is extremely worrying. I mean, because ultimately, as you know, Covaxin has already been given to like lakhs and lakhs of
Yes.
people across the country without phase
Yes.
3 data. And when the phase 3 data does come out, it'll be the basis of several important decisions, because it will tell us how safe the vaccine is and how
Mm-hmm.
efficacious it is. And if you allow this data to go, unfiltered into the final analysis, then we're all going to be stuck with a vaccine we don't know very well.
If you liked listening to this episode, please subscribe to The Big Story for episodic updates. We're available on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, JioSaavn, and most of the other popular podcast streaming platforms. For other podcasts, please log on to the Quint website, and for any feedback, please shoot an email to podcast@thequint.com.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.